None at all. So, so I guess we'll start off. I'll give, I talked you up a little bit in the email that I sent out. So I'll give a brief little intro, but you could probably do a better job of giving your background than I can.
Yeah, and
More
I'm
accurate.
happy to
So what people kind of know already, neuroscience background, associate professor at University of Miami, but more importantly, your name does come up regularly, largely with like the research that you do around mindfulness, specifically attention, and then I guess even more specifically, mindfulness and attention as it pertains to high stress environments and the work you've done with military, police, and beyond. So I guess we could start with just, if you want to give maybe a little bit more accurate background, brief bio of yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll just start by saying kind of what anchors my thinking and my work. Mm-hmm. And that really is, as you already mentioned, attention. So in my lab at the University of Miami, and you've been able to be there, so I'm glad that you've seen us in action. Yeah. We study the brain's attention system. So we use, functional MRI, we use brain electrical recordings, behavioral measures, et cetera. And that's been a part of my life since the very early days. In fact, some of my undergraduate research was on attention as well. So attention is very important. And really what I was interested in from that point of view is how it works. How is it implemented in the brain? But then after doing that for many years, what became clear to me is we know a lot about how it works. And sometimes it doesn't work so well and it doesn't serve us. Mm-hmm. And I think most of us are kind of feeling this crisis of attention, that we don't quite have a hold on this resource that we know we need to have. So what became sort of a first pivot of my work was, well, what makes attention vulnerable to failing? And there were a consistent theme of things that were coming up. So being in a poor mood, having too much stress, experiencing threat, and a host of other things like lack of sleep, poor nutrition, not enough physical activity. I mean, the list goes on and on of all the vulnerabilities in attention. And so after realizing, we get a sense of what attention is, very powerful, what makes it vulnerable. This is now kind of where mindfulness entered my lab's work, because what I realized is that for many professions, it was going to be unlikely that they're going to be able to avoid these aspects of life experiences that would degrade attention. Mm-hmm. And so mindfulness training as a form of brain training to strengthen attention became the focus of what we're interested in, what we explore.
So when you started, was the mindfulness kind of component of it there from the beginning, or was it more of like this recognition after the fact, like, okay, here's this really powerful tool that actually directly impacts the work that you were already doing?
Oh, it was not only was it not part of my thinking, but I was sort of had a real bias or skepticism regarding it. Yeah. And remember, this was my pivot of my work with regard to mindfulness happened pretty early on in sort of the way that we think about mindfulness now. I mean, back in 2002 or 2003 or 4, that I first started thinking, I want to start moving in this direction. There was really nothing on the landscape there with regard to mindfulness. But part of my bias against it just came from my personal history. I mean, I grew up in an Indian family, Hindu family. I saw my parents meditating since I was so young. Yeah. And it was a very normal thing, normalized thing. And I always thought, that's great, but, like, I'm a Western trained scientist. This is not something I'm going to consider. And if there's no evidence for this being effective, no, thank you. I mean, it was a kind of hard edge about it. Mm-hmm. And I would say what drew me into even considering it was that I decided I would try it out because of my own stress levels and my own sense of overwhelm. Yeah. As a young parent, I was just starting out my career with my own lab and husband in grad school. So I was so stressed out that I'm like, I need something because nothing is working right now. And I know I'm not performing it I'm not in peak shape anymore. I'm pretty checked out. Yeah. And so mindfulness was an option that was actually introduced to me by a colleague, another neuroscience colleague, Rishi Davidson. And I was kind of shocked when even he said it. I was like, what are you talking about? Yeah. But gave it a try, valued and trusted his opinion enough to say, let me be open to this, and started practicing on my own. And it wasn't until I really started experiencing the benefits directly where I felt more present to my life. I felt able to actually engage with my family members more, and everything in my life wasn't a blur anymore. I was like there for it, embodied.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what, I know that the instructions are entirely around attention, and we happen to have all these tools to study attention. Let's bring it to the lab and study it.
Yeah.
So it definitely came as an afterthought.
Yeah, which I think is important to note, because I think sometimes there's the assumption that when research shows up, people kind of go into it with a bias of like, I'm just trying to prove that this works. Whereas you came from a completely different space. It wasn't, like you even said, there was even a resistance to it in the beginning where it's like,
yeah, it's like,
wishy-washy, my parents did it. And then it was like, no, actually, you know what, there is something here. And then for it to now really have taken the path that it has for you.
Yeah. And, at the same time that I was considering mindfulness, the kind of field of attention research was in its own sort of crisis, because many researchers were coming to the same realization as I was, which is that attention is vulnerable and it should be trainable.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are many training modalities starting to be introduced. So brain training games, right? So video games that you could play to make your attention stronger, or all these funky devices, like have lights and sounds flash at you, and all of a sudden you can pay attention better.
Yeah.
And from our look at the literature, none of those were really cutting it. They weren't actually showing benefits that were generalizable.
Yeah.
Meaning that if you played a brain training game, you might get better at the game, but probably not better at much else in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So that was also like, I was on a little bit of a hunt to see what could show benefits that were for sure not just getting better at the training task.
Mm-hmm. What kind of creates that differentiation between, getting better at just paying attention to something very specific, like a game? Are we moving more from a skill set that is applied only to this specific environment into something more generalized? What exactly does that entail?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly it. So, I mean, we can think about it as physical fitness, right? So, or a particular kind of motor activity. So if you learn how to play, let's think of like learning to play the piano or some
Mm-hmm.
kind of specific motor task, and you train on that over and over again in the context of playing piano. And then somebody gives you some other thing to do. Let's say it's, I don't know, some other thing that requires fine motor movement. It's very unlikely that that'll transfer over. Like the fact that you can move your fingers in this very synchronized, orderly way as you learn to play the piano isn't going to necessarily be domain general, meaning in another totally different context, your fingers are going to work like magic there. Mm-hmm. And it's just the nature of how the brain actually functions. It will, whatever we do to train it, it will get stronger at, right? So we know that for the good stuff, like learning how to play the piano, but for the bad stuff too. If we train ourselves into terrible habits, right, we're really good at that. So the specificity of brain training has always been around.
Yeah.
What people were finding is if you have somebody play a video game, they'll get better and better at the video game. But now if you switch up very subtle things like the physical display or the kind of granularity of the cursor or of the mouse, the controller, people start messing up. They're kind of like, it's a totally new landscape now.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by generalizability. These aren't like core ways of improving attention or working memory. These were task-specific training.
Yeah.
And if you take it out of video games, like in your real life, you want to be better able to pay attention to the road when you're driving or to a colleague when you're having a conversation. There's no hope that it's going to transfer to that far away from the training context.
So what is it about mindfulness that, from the outside looking in, it could look like mindfulness would almost be the same thing. Like I could get really good at paying attention while I'm sitting and being quiet and not doing anything. But why does it transfer so well into other parts of our life as opposed to something like a training video game?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we didn't know if it would, right? We had no idea. When we first brought this to the laboratory, like, let's get people trained up in something like a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And let's use our tasks that we use just to probe attention, just in terms of its basic brain function, give it to them before and after, and see if anything changes. And it could have been that we saw nothing change, right? Because paying attention, closing your eyes and paying attention to your breath may not transfer over into doing this very specific computer-based task where you're kind of trying to pay attention to different parts of the screen, et cetera. But it did have an impact. So that was the first thing. It's like, it does transfer. But I think you're asking just a really great question, which is why would that be? Why would it be that it's not that you just become like a Olympian level breath follower or something,
right?
Right? And I think part of it has to do with the really compelling aspect of what happens when people start practicing, which is generalizable. So I would say, and you tell me, I mean, you're the teacher. So one of the deep insights that it seems, or key insights that seems to be what people get when they start practicing, is this acknowledgement that their mind has a mind of its own, that there is chatter going on that you might not even been privy to before.
Mhm.
And that internal chatter is impacting you in ways that you might not have even noticed before.
Yeah.
So just that understanding that the mind has this capacity to wander, and that wandering may be derailing my ability to do anything, whether it is having a conversation or it is even following my breath. That is a more fundamental and more generalizable understanding of your mind.
Yeah.
And then through the training, what you're getting better at, really what you're asking, I think, is what actually gets trained with mindfulness training that would make it amenable to generalizability. But what we think happens through the training is that you become more and more capable of not only noticing that the mind is wandering, but then to redirect it back to the task at hand when you're sitting there doing a breath awareness practice, for example.
Yeah.
And those are much more central, because the mind wandering could be of so many different things, right? And even when you're doing a practice, it could be returning to breath-related sensations. It could be returning to body sensations. If you're doing a body scan, it could be returning to the nature of open monitoring. So even through the course of something like an MBSR suite, we're giving them kind of, I would say, mental cross-training. So you're switching it up, but the thing that stays stable is focus, notice, redirect.
Yeah.
And I think that's what can carry over.
Yeah, I think, part of the way I've always experienced it, and partially how I talk about it, is the first part that you mentioned, I think, is huge. It's just the acknowledgement and the recognition that this is the way that the brain works. Like sometimes just that alone can completely shift kind of a paradigm for somebody. This recognition that there is this thing called attention, and it doesn't always go where we want it, and it's very subject to being pulled in lots of different directions. It really wants to follow the next shiny object, and if we're not paying attention to it, we just go along with it wherever it goes. And it sounds, sometimes when you first start mindfulness practice, meditation, it sounds so simple and insignificant to say, notice when your mind is somewhere else and come back to where you want to be. And it's like, okay, why is that so important? Well, you might go years without doing that if you've ever never been told and it's never been brought to your attention that this is what the mind is doing. So you might just be living on the whim of wherever your attention wants to go without ever actually acknowledging, okay, I can come back. And I think one of the ways I've described it, and maybe there's this, maybe you could point out if there's a flaw in this description, is so we know, and a lot of this I think really happened right kind of at the turning point, what you were talking about, early 2000s, where like all this extra, there was a big shift in how much research was actually being dedicated to mindfulness. I think we went from a handful of published studies a year to now over 1,000 a year, if I'm not mistaken. And it was this understanding with neuroplasticity and fMRI and all these things that actually allowed us as a Western society to see, like, this isn't just 2,000-year-old wishy-washy talk, like you said, that our, parents and hippies are doing. Like, this is actually comparable to going to the gym and training an athlete. And like, these are measurable, predictable outcomes. And part of this generalization idea, I think, is where this would tie best into is, I've said oftentimes, people ask, well, what does sitting and paying attention to my breath have to do with anything in the rest of my life? I said, it may be comparable a lot of ways to if you think about an athlete going to the weight room. A football player, they go and they squat and their legs get stronger. And that strength is going to help them on the field, but they're not going to squat in the middle of the football field. But the strength and the quote unquote muscle they're developing is directly transferable to where it actually matters. And it feels a lot to me like attention is very similar to that. I don't know if that parallels with
Absolutely.
the science.
Yeah, I think it's the core kind of workhorse systems, right? If you think about core muscle groups, this is the brain's sort of core workhorse processes that most people aren't even in touch with, that these are constantly operating in their lives. So not only acknowledging their nature and how they tend to operate, but then working to strengthen them can have these very broad effects. And I think it's also has a lot to do with the way that teachers can support that. So that we're not just relegating mindfulness, a mindful orientation toward experience, to when you're practicing quietly in your own, living room or something,
Right.
but that you're actively thinking about how it's showing up in other aspects of your life, or you're actively attempting to bring it into other aspects of your life, right? So like mindfulness of a Zoom meeting, or whatever it is, like,
Right.
or parenting, right? So that now it's not just about doing kind of mindful activities with your kids, but your children become the focus of your mindfulness. They are the target object in the mindfulness practice. So you're watching them with this curiosity and this sort of non-judgmental awareness and stability. And that can be so powerful, because often with the most precious people in our lives, we tend to they become part of the white space. We don't do that with them. So
yeah, and I think equally as important, and this is the part I think that people are resistant to oftentimes in the beginning. It's not just about trying to be more present with these big glowing positive parts of our day, but it's the benefit that we now know of how we can benefit from actually being present with the more challenging and difficult parts of our lives as well. It really is important, I think, to highlight. It's really difficult to just try to be very selective of like, okay, let me turn on present moment awareness in my attention when I feel like I want to, and then turn it off when I feel like I want to disconnect, because it's turning it off and trying to, in a lot of ways, escape or distract ourselves when things aren't particularly present. It's going to be exponentially harder to try to turn it back on and turn into it for those moments that we do want to be there. And I think maybe that's part of that kind of generalized strength that we were talking about.
yeah, but I agree with you that I think that shifting in that way is very tricky, but it's also like not really the way that our attention system works. We can't not pay attention.
Right.
And this is the nature of attention. Attention is always paid fully. So, and think about what that means. So, I think about this when I'm driving and just how it shows up, right? So if you're on a road and you're driving and things are really nice, it's a beautiful sunny day, there's not much traffic, and you want to let your mind wander, no biggie.
Mm-hmm.
You're able to now have less attention to the road itself and more attention kind of go internally. And in that way, kind of distributed across the external environment and the driving task, and then whatever you want to think about, you're fully utilizing your attention.
Mm-hmm.
And now as we go toward, actually it's starting to get cloudy outside, traffic is picking up, there's a hailstorm, all of a sudden we're going to redistribute the resources. So I'm not going to be thinking about my own thoughts other than the intrusive thought that's like, I better pay attention or else I might die, right?
Right.
I'm going to really focus on the external environment. So that trade-off between where our attention goes to the external environment, internal environment, pleasant or unpleasant, that distribution is always happening. So in parallel with that attention is moving around in this way, we add through mindfulness training a layer of awareness of what is going on. And I think just knowing that, you're mindlessly scrolling and you're on I don't know how many times you scroll through your phone, like something like that, where all of a sudden you realize, I have been using my attention in this way. My attention is being fully utilized. I just wasn't aware that I was doing this. So I think it's both things. It's that there's always a trade-off, and that with mindfulness training, we can cultivate the capacity to bring the lens of awareness onto where it goes, to then have a moment of control to redistribute it as we choose, or that serves the situation or kind of our broader goals better.
Yeah. What about this idea of, if I'm not mistaken, this article is attached to your research, but I could be wrong, the multitasking is a myth.
Yeah.
That was directly from your research, correct?
I mean, that's a big body of research within the attention literature, right? And I think this is another thing that most people don't think about. So even though it is the case that it's kind of like the first principle of attention is that you're always paying attention. Unless you're asleep, attention is going somewhere. You may not have conscious awareness of where that is. You may not be meta aware, but it is getting utilized in some some full way. And then the second thing is that attention is very limited, meaning that, especially when it comes to things that require effort, mental effort, we can pretty much only pay attention to one thing at a time.
Yeah.
And that's why this sort of flashlight metaphor for attention works well. I mean, you can't have a single flashlight pointing in 5 directions at once. Yeah. And so there is no such thing as multitasking. It's actually task switching, where you're engaging and then disengaging and then moving it somewhere else. Yeah. And I think that's also a powerful awareness for people, that not only that they're doing this, they're not in a situation where they're able to check their text messages, respond to email, talk to their spouse and compose their, manuscript that they want to compose. It's not happening. Like, you're going to be failing probably at all of those. Yeah. But also realizing that when we try to multitask, we're exhausting this attentional capacity overall, which is sort of the third point of attention, which is attention is depletable. Yeah. So, we always use it, can pretty much only use one thing at a time, and there's not much of it. So when we move it around like this, we're spending out our attentional energy, if you will, by the engaging, disengaging aspect. Yeah. So we're working against ourselves when we do that.
Yeah. And it's a huge loss in efficiency, correct? Because isn't there like so basically every time we switch from one task to the next, even if it's happening really quickly, isn't there always kind of like a reacquaintance with the new task when we go back to it, even though we were just with it moments ago?
Totally. You're slower when you re-engage with the same task. You're just as a slower uptake. You got to reacquaint yourself. You got to get the context of the task again. Yeah. Probably more prone to performance errors right when you switch from one task to another. And the more you switch, the more often that happens. Because then you got to expend more resources to kind of get yourself back on track. Yeah. To correct for the kind of little downturn in your performance when you switch.
Yeah, I equate that often to it's the writing the email, and then someone walks in and asks you a question, and then when you go back to it, you have to reread where you left off to figure out how to start again. And that one's a big, obvious kind of one. But I think in a lot of ways it feels like, at least to me, I don't know if this lines up with the way it's working, when there's multiple things in your mind, as you're bouncing back and forth, every time you kind of go back to whatever it is, point A, it doesn't really feel like you're making any progress on the thought, because you have to keep kind of like just going back and starting over again. It's like, okay, where was I? And then you're distracted again.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that the thing to remember is that attention doesn't really care if it's being directed to the external environment or internal environment. That flashlight, when you talked about the email and the person, is just being directed here or here. But you could think about it in your mind as well, of thought A versus, concept B. Yeah. And there's a task switching cost there as well. Yeah. And unfortunately, this is where things like rumination or intrusive thoughts can be so problematic, because in some sense, they hijack your attention away. You're all of a sudden thinking about that kind of uncomfortable or unpleasant thought and you're there in the middle of it without even knowing how you got there. But then you got to extract yourself out of it to get back to the task at hand. Yeah. So absolutely, it's task switching in the world and it's task switching in our minds, and both can be really problematic. Yeah.
The point you brought up about it being depletable, is that directly kind of correlated to why we see with like air traffic controllers, while there's, kind of these high pressure life or death jobs where there's limitations on, like, you can't work for X amount of time without taking breaks. Is that correlated to that? Or
it is. It's something called the Vigilance Decrement, which I think is a kind of a terrible name for it, but the basic feature of Vigilance Decrement is, if you have to pay attention in a sustained fashion for a period of time, your performance on that task is going to get worse over time. And I call it depletable, but I just want to be clear on that, because what we actually think is happening is that the thing that gets depleted is our meta awareness of how we're engaging in the task. Okay. So it's like you start losing track of what's important in the moment, right? So when you're not monitoring, your performance gets worse. But that kind of systematic decline over time. So if you're doing something for 20 minutes, your performance at the beginning of the 20 minutes is probably really high, and then it goes down and down and down. It's really, really prominent when the task is pretty boring, right? So like the air traffic controller, it's like, there's not much going on, But if you screw up, it's lives. And same thing goes with like sort of monitoring equipment in an ICU, or I think of like the baggage handlers the baggage checkers, right? When we go to the airport, or police on patrol, or people that are watching out for forest fires. Like there's so many instances, or, like a Secret Service person kind of surveying the environment to make sure there's no threats. This kind of sentinel way of being, like you're there, you're monitoring, is so important, but so fragile. Like we're pretty bad at it. So that's the sort of depletable aspect, is that we can train our mind through mindfulness training to be able to keep performance steady. The vigilance decline isn't as profound in somebody who practices mindfulness training, but we think the reason may be because you're getting more meta aware. So you're checking in more often with, am I on task? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Let me redirect. So it's those micro returns that you do that end up looking like performance is stable instead of declining.
Yeah. So these, when it does tail, it doesn't tail for as long.
Exactly. You're not like off, like writing, thinking about your next novel that you're going to write, or your next vacation. You're actually back in the task at hand pretty quickly.
Yeah, it kind of ties in. We actually talked a little bit last month about this. I mentioned it to you on the phone, to this idea of starting over again, and how, it's starting over again, sometimes applied to this when we look at something like awareness. It's not about not drifting off. That's important. It's really about the recognition of the drifting off and the willingness to keep coming back that matters more than anything. Because someone can say, yeah, I only drifted off once, but I didn't realize it until a week later, and then someone else, they recognize it every 7 seconds, and it's just, okay, come back.
Yeah. And that becomes really fascinating when you look at like adept meditators, right? Like the Olympians of meditation.
Yeah.
And I remember this conversation I had with Mathieu Ricard, who is this eminent, Western scientist, French man who ended up becoming a Buddhist monk. But he would say things like, because I asked him, like, you've been practicing for so many decades, Mathieu, what is different about your mind? And he would say, exactly what you just pinpointed, that it's not that I don't wander. It's that I can see it sort of like if you think of a calm pond, I see a little undulation off in the distance and I can catch it then. It's not a full-on wave like knocking me over before I notice something is happening.
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool, because it kind of gave me hope that, well, I can do that. I mean, what I thought he was going to tell me is that, well, he sets his mind to one thing and it never wavers, and he's not saying that. He's saying I'm more sensitive to its wavering nature, so I can redirect it back when I want it to go back to where it was.
Yeah, I think a lot of people say it in a lot of different forms. I think Sharon Salzberg is maybe who I heard say that the most important moment in your meditation is the moment you recognize that your mind has wandered. So to not be frustrated by it, to actually celebrate it. Like, oh, I've noticed, because it's like we said, you might not ever notice if you're not actually aware of kind of the capacity to pay attention, that meta awareness of like, where is my mind right now? Yeah. So to notice that it's wandered and that it's not where you want to be is everything, because it's in that moment that you actually create the opportunity to make a choice to be somewhere else, to come back or to not. Maybe sometimes choosing not to is the best option.
It's like, I really want to keep planning my next vacation.
Right.
But I think, I think that what you're bringing up now is actually so important, and it kind of speaks to the misrepresentation of mindfulness, sort of given that it's kind of taken on this popular interest and imagination. So often I'll get requests for interviews or, for articles or whatever. And they're like, tell me how mindfulness is going to make me more able to be blissed out and happy.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, it may actually make you less happy, and that's not something people want to hear.
Yep.
But I think that's so important to say, when there is awareness applied to one's life, you have to then be able to see what awareness is shining its light on, right? I mean, and often, especially when I talk to undergrads, I teach this class at University of Miami, and in addition to learning about the science of mindfulness, they also learn to practice. And it's so interesting because maybe 4 or 5 weeks in, they'll start saying, I think I'm mind wandering more now. I wasn't really mind wandering at the beginning of the semester, and now I'm like really mind wandering. Like, how is this happening that I'm mind wandering? And then we kind of go into it. It's like, are you really mind wandering more now, or are you aware that your
Yep.
mind has this capacity and is doing this? And, we haven't done this yet, but in the lab, I really want to be able to track this. I bet the amount of mind wandering people experience is like kind of an inverted U, where when they have no experience, they would say, my mind doesn't wander much. But as you start training them, they're actually reporting more and more wandering. Then they probably will also be able to have some control over that. And actually the amount of mind wandering might go down.
Yep.
But the awareness of it is such a tricky thing, because it gives you the sense that maybe it's occurring more just because you were blind to it before. Of course,
yeah, and I think I see that shows up in classes sometimes too, where it is a lot of people kind of show up with this. They saw a bunch of magazine covers and whatever. That's, stereotypically they probably saw some, you know, middle-aged white women in white gowns floating on Time magazine or something, and they're like, this is, and it with joy under it, and that's exactly what they're expecting. And they show up with, people that show up to a class, they don't show up by accident, so there is something that pulled them there. But oftentimes it's not uncommon. I would say it probably happens with at least one person in every class, where it's that inverted U, where they kind of started at one point, but then they really started paying attention, and their discomfort and maybe even anxiety and stress may actually begin to rise from that attention. And there's the possibility, and the way I tell people is that peak might be at week 8. So you might have gotten to the most difficult part when this class ends. So there's certainly no guarantee that this is just going to make you feel better. And you might actually leave here feeling worse. But you'll be aware of something, and you'll know a little bit more about what's going on than you did when you got here. But to say that for sure I'm going to feel better than when I came here, there's definitely no guarantee about that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really good point to make to people. But also, what I think you offer in classes like the classes that you teach and something like MBSR is, it's not only that we gain more and more awareness, and that our noting of kind of negative or unpleasant states increases, and where we might conclude, okay, there's more unpleasantness here than there was before. Other tools are provided so that you relate to that experience in a different way.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, most of my lab's work has to do with this component of focusing attention, stabilizing attention, meta awareness, and mind wandering, all the stuff we've been talking about. But there are sort of two other important, well, at least one other important aspect, I would say, that is very important to being able to relate differently toward the experience itself, which can be described in many ways. I mean, sort of the technical term would be decentering, right? So this idea that you experience your mind as from a self-distance perspective. So you're not in the thought, you're aware that the thought is occurring.
Yeah.
And it goes actually back to multitasking. So our mind can't do two things at once. Right. So we can either be here or we can be here. If we're actually at a distance perspective, we're going to feel less of that negativity just because we're not immersed in it. Yeah. We're actually over here watching the experience of sadness or whatever it is, agitation. And it's very difficult to be simultaneously very agitated and watching agitation.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very powerful way that when people start realizing I'm mind wandering more, or I'm having more unpleasantness in my life, the guidance to do this observation of that mental content from a distance perspective can really help calm everything down a little bit more.
It's such a powerful and important component of what's offered in the class, and just in mindfulness in general. And it's also the place where people who are really hesitant to get into the practice in the first place start going, wait a second, because it sounds very like out of body-ish, like, but what does this mean? But the fascinating thing about it is there's so much actual hard science and neurology behind what we're actually talking about when we do that. People hear that as like, they almost envision like I'm supposed to float over my body and just watch what I'm doing. And it's like, no, it's removing yourself from kind of the uncoupling yourself from the emotion and the investment that you have in the current situation. The example I give sometimes that I think helps a lot is I say, imagine a scenario that you're going through, And now imagine one of your closest friends going through the exact same scenario, and think about what advice you would give them. And why can't you give yourself the exact same advice?
Yeah.
Because it shouldn't make any difference. It's just you don't have the same emotion and investment in their particular case that you have in yours. So it's easier to see. And when we really begin to kind of see that, and I can look at like, what is Lucas doing right now? Like, what is his experience? What is this emotion that he's experiencing right now? It becomes much easier to work with. Not easy, but easier.
Right, right. And I think that it's actually, you have the capacity to do it with more granularity because you're watching it, right? So even thinking about a negative experience, a negative emotion arising, and taking this kind of distanced or decentered perspective toward the experience of the emotion, if you're now paying attention to what body sensations are arising, or kind of what is the exact emotion that you're experiencing? Is it sadness, or is it fear, or is it a little bit of threat? Like all those kind of more granular observations can happen from this distance perspective, because you're not so lost in it that you're blind in some sense. You're in the fog. You're not looking at the fog.
Yeah. It's, the mindfulness aspect of turning into experience as opposed to turning away. When we turn into discomfort, when we turn into, like, I use the example all the time from somebody, one of the classes, with their knee. They talk about their knee is just in pain. It's been in pain for years. And it's like when you turn into it, describe it, but you can't use the word pain. Like, really describe what the sensations are. Okay. The right side of it is tingly, the back is warm, there's a throbbing, it comes and it goes. And then you can see it through the description. It's like, it's breaking it up, and it's like, oh, it was just largely misproperly classified. I can work with all of these things.
Right.
But when it was just pain, debilitating, can't do anything, you didn't even have the chance.
Exactly. And this is where it's so interesting, because the things that make our mind, the human brain, so unique and powerful are also our biggest challenges.
Yeah.
So, one aspect of the brain that most scientists think is uniquely human is being able to do this mental time travel, right? So we can take our minds and place ourselves in the past or the future. Not only that, we can place ourselves in the minds of other people. Like, what will Lucas do in this situation? Like, I can actually put my mind, say I'm in your mind now, and I'm kind of looking at the world through you. So powerful. And also makes us so amenable to being lost. And the second thing, in addition to mental time travel, I think is so interesting, powerful, and problematic, is the capacity of the mind to engage in concepts as a shorthand for experience. So I love that you tell somebody, I want you to describe this experience, but you can't use the word pain. You're kind of disabling the conceptual mind. And now what else can they lean on? They can only lean on their direct experience, which is going to be in this sensory, non-conceptual realm.
Yeah.
And I think that even when people understand that the creation of concepts is something the mind is actively simulating, that can also be kind of freeing in some sense. Oh, okay, I just came up with that thought. That thought's generated in my mind. And, you've probably heard this and probably say this too, but, thoughts are not facts. And, but to know that this very powerful capacity of the human brain to simulate experiences is what puts us in these very strange situations where all of a sudden we forget that this is a completely fabricated, self-described story that I've generated, and it's one of many I could have generated.
Yeah. Our direct experience is that, we're taking in so much more information in every moment than we could possibly imagine, and our mind is doing the best it can to create a visual narrative out of that, and it's why 10 of us can be in the room and see the exact same thing and all see something different, have a different experience. It could be great for some people and horrible for others. But I think, I call it, like treacherous perception. Like we're taking it in, but we're seeing what our mind has decided it wants to see. We talk about this idea of your eyes don't actually see anything. They just absorb light waves and you create a picture out of them. But I think when you really come to grips with that, there's a tremendous power in that, because it reminds you that your experience is negotiable. It's not, it has to be this. if we're actually there for it and we're aware of it, just like we were talking about aware of awareness, this meta awareness, that's, if we're aware that like we're seeing the interpretation of what we've taken in, but maybe there's more. What am I not seeing? Is there a different way to look at this? What other perspective can I layer on top of this? There's a freedom to that of knowing like, okay, this, it feels like this was the hand that I was dealt, but it's not always the case. I can change some of my cards if I want to, but I have to be aware of the capacity to do that first, you know?
Yeah, exactly. We have to be aware of the story we've created before we can start seeing how we can shift around the furniture, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
One thing, you know, in the last couple minutes here, what can be said about the importance of consistency of practice in terms of what we know from a neurological standpoint?
right, right. Well, the first thing that I would say about practice, and it's even before we get to consistency. So just if you're in the course of a multi-week program, we do see these pre-post differences. So if you sample somebody's attention before and after, or their mood before and after, you find that people that go through a multi-week MBSR course, for example, have better attention, have more positive mood, less negative mood. But then when you break it down as a function of the individual and what they did during those 8 weeks in terms of how much practice they engaged in, there's a second layer to this, which is that the more you practice, the more you benefit. So even though as a group, people that take the course are better off than those that don't, within the course, those that practice more benefit more. So some of the studies that we've done have actually looked at what happens. You know, most people are not going to say they're going to do like if you think of a pharmacologic study, like a washout trial, right? In pharmacology, you take a drug, people benefit from the drug, and then half the people are told, stop taking it. And if it's helping them, they're probably gonna be like, no, I'm not going to stop taking it's helpful.
Okay.
I mean, we've had that kind of thing happen even with mindfulness training. I've never actively done a washout trial where I tell people to stop practicing.
Mm-hmm.
But typically what happens in our research studies is we'll partner with an organization, we're supporting people getting the training, and then we're gone, right? We're done with our research. Yeah. Sometimes we get to come back and actually sample them 6 months later, 4 months later, some period of time later. And it's almost a natural experiment. Some people will continue to maintain their practice and some people will discontinue. We've also done it so that in some organizations, we support them continuing. So for example, with the military, we've said, okay, for the next 4 weeks before you see us again, every day at the end of your daily workout, you're going to do a 15-minute practice that's just built into your day. Mm-hmm. Other people aren't told that. So what happens there is the people that maintain their practice and are supported to do so continue to show maintained benefits. And those that don't go back down to baseline.
Yeah.
So it's this very interesting, it's what we call a dose response function, right? So the more you practice, the more you benefit. When you discontinue practice, you start seeing a reduction in the benefit. Yeah. And that's why I think that, kind of what you were describing to me, that this sort of speaker series is part of, is so powerful, because if you can keep your practice going as part of your kind of normal everyday activities, the chances of it continuing to benefit you are going to be greater.
Yeah.
Like anything else, just very much like physical activity.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned just briefly there the work with the military. Some people are familiar with you because of the work specifically you've done with, you've the interviews with the general and Anderson Cooper and the work that you've done specifically. What, would you mind going into a little bit more about what, I guess, kind of the interest in working with the military is, what their interest might be, and what you've seen in doing that so far?
Yeah, sure. So I think that we started out talking about attention and its vulnerabilities, right? And the circumstances that may actually make attention more vulnerable are things like stress and poor mood and threat, and sleep degradation, all these kind of factors that compromise attention kind of describe what pre-deployment training and deployment itself are. Mm-hmm. And you can't avoid it. And it's not just that kind of a high stress, high performance group, but first responders are actually in a very similar situation as well. So knowing that the circumstances and the requirements of their professional setting will compromise not only their attention, but their self-regulation and their mood, their ability to kind of take in and be situationally aware of their environment, all these things will get compromised. Part of the partnership with the military has been to see what we could do in terms of providing training to protect against that.
Yeah.
So how can you keep attention stable and mood stable and situational awareness intact, even under very difficult, complex circumstances?
Given the environment that's really kind of been highlighted lately, particularly with police and enforcement, what kind of potential benefit could there be to providing mindfulness training, ongoing mindfulness training?
Yeah. Well, I think that that's a huge topic, right?
That is a big one, so we don't.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of summarize, I mean, I think it there's very few studies that have been done well on this topic, just to say with mindfulness in particular, but the case is very straightforward, right? So you put people in these circumstances, when their attention is compromised, they tend to go on autopilot. So any biases that are held will just drive their behavior. And so not only do you have that, like the thinking mind is sort of compromised, but you have these other factors that are sort of latent in the person's thinking and performance that kind of become more salient. So the hope is that we offer mindfulness training and people will be able to preserve those functions, preserve their capacity to engage in the world. But the other thing that is more well studied, actually, that has a lot of, I think, potential to have benefits, is doing something like loving kindness practice. There's a lot of research now, I think 20 studies or so, that have looked at loving kindness practice and implicit bias reduction. So that these biases we might have as a function of somebody's race or gender or sexual orientation or gender identity, whatever it is, are these things that we know are problematic and lead to discriminatory behavior and harassment, or excessive force in the case of a lot of the contexts we're talking about now, are benefited by loving kindness practice. And it's essentially thought that this is tied to this ability to do perspective taking for another person, and to become more aware of the things that are getting in the way of you offering these well wishes to people. Because they kind of highlight the thing that's the resistance that might make you want to question what drives that. So it's a complicated story in terms of the mechanism, but I think that both connection practices like loving kindness and mindfulness training can be very powerful in helping people like the first responders, police officers, deal with the challenges that the circumstances that they're asked to be in promote.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like what we were saying. It's a muscle that isn't being exercised, properly, particularly in a job where, it could change everything. It's the ability to meet people differently,
Exactly.
and I hope that we see some change with that. There's a lot of push for it, for sure, but it'll get there. So, I guess in short, I don't know if you want to mention, I don't know if there's anything you can mention about, you just finished putting together your book.
I'm hoping a year from now I can actually give you the title and tell people to go buy it. But right now it's coming, 2021.
Okay.
And the book will be about these topics that we've just been discussing: attention, its vulnerabilities, and what we can do about it.
Great.
Using mindfulness and other tools.
Excellent. Other than that, I think you've answered all the questions that we needed to answer in the world. So we're all good now. We can just move forward.
Awesome.
But I know you're very busy. You're very demanded. I'm really grateful for you carving out some time for us. This will be a very valuable resource for the people that were here and for people down the road. And then as we begin to open back up, we'll have more happenings through U Mindfulness and at the University of Miami. Obviously, there's no timeline on any of that right now, but
absolutely. I just want to say one last thing, just sort of about you and we met because of your own commitment and persistence. I mean, we didn't know each other, right? And I want to just tell you how impressed I've been with your efforts, and also just the creativity you're taking in figuring out ways to make these practices accessible for people. So I want to just commend you on that. I think it's a really powerful and unique strategy that you're using, and keeping a community growing and alive is so beneficial. So thank you for doing that. I think it's really advancing. It's going to make the world, it's making the world a better place. So thanks for that to you,
Oh,
Luke.
thank you. We're trying to find ways. So
Awesome.
we'll keep fine tuning. So again, Mishi, thank you very much. And
Thank
we'll talk
you.
soon.
Okay, sounds
All right.
good.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Mishi.